On December 5, 2014, a flight operated by Korean Air was set to fly from New York City to Seoul, South Korea. But before it could even get off the ground, several people's lives were permanently altered by a bag of nuts. But despite where you might think this is going, it's not a story about someone having an allergic reaction and the traumatized passengers who witness it. Instead, the story centers around Cho Hyun-ah, also known as Heather Cho, a vice president at Korean Air who was sitting in first class for that flight. As the plane was preparing to take off, a flight attendant handed Mrs. Cho a bag of macadamia nuts. And this is when all hell broke loose. Cho was instantly enraged because she was served the nuts in a bag instead of in a bowl. Yes, that's the grave offense that started this whole thing. Cho began screaming at the flight attendant, a woman named Kim Do-hee, reportedly yelling, "What kind of service is this?" and berating her for a minute before realizing that she should really be yelling at Kim's boss. So she called over the cabin crew chief, Park Chang-jin, and began screaming at him instead, throwing the bag of nuts against a wall in the process. She asked Park why she had been served macadamia nuts in a bag instead of in a bowl, to which he replied that his crew was simply following the official Korean Air service manual. Cho then demanded that they bring her the service manual to prove it. So Park grabbed a tablet which had the manual on it. Nervous from the situation, he accidentally mistyped the password for the tablet, causing Cho to get even more upset. But once he was able to get the manual open, he showed Cho proof that the flight attendant had correctly followed the guidelines for the cabin crew when it comes to serving macadamia nuts. And if they had a whole thing dedicated to that, I can only imagine how long that manual was. It's just a shame that they didn't have a section for what to do when a vice president of the company throws the bag of nuts at you. Unfortunately, the evidence that she was wrong did not do much to calm down Mrs. Cho. Instead, she continued yelling at both Kim and Park, eventually forcing them to get on their knees and beg for her forgiveness. That might seem intense, but anyone who's ever been handed a bag of macadamia nuts instead of having them presented to you in a bowl can understand the frustration. While the flight attendants were on their knees, Cho continued berating them and then grabbed the tablet and started hitting Park's knuckles with it. Again, I think we can all agree that this is a pretty rational response considering what Cho had endured. She then fired Park and demanded that the plane be sent back to the gate so he can be kicked off. The entire interaction took place in the first-class cabin, but there was only one other passenger flying first class on that flight. And I can only imagine the severe discomfort that person was experiencing in that moment. Sorry to interrupt, but could I trouble you for a ginger ale when you have a chance? The plane, which still hadn't taken off at this point, taxied back to the gate, where Park was let off, into JFK Airport despite the fact that he's Korean. Don't worry, Park, we'll let you buy a ticket back. The flight then took off 46 minutes late. Flight attendant Kim Do-hee was not dismissed, since Cho had shifted her hatred towards Park at some point. But we can only imagine the tension in that first-class cabin during the flight. And it's a good thing the moist towelette was the right temperature, otherwise we would have had to run the whole thing back. Now, if you've heard this story and you're wondering how Heather Cho had enough power to not only fire the cabin crew chief for something this trivial, but also to turn the plane around and order it back to the gate, allow me to provide some context. Mrs. Cho was not just a vice president at Korean Air. She was also the daughter of Korean Air chairman and CEO Cho Yang-ho. You see, large South Korean conglomerates, known in the country as Chaebols, are often controlled by powerful families. Members of these families are practically nobility, which is why everyone unquestionably obeyed Heather Cho throughout her macadamia nut tirade. Following the whole thing, Korean Air went out of their way to silence the incident and prevent it from getting into the public eye. This included contacting Park and Kim and pressuring them into lying about the situation during the investigation from South Korea's Ministry of Transport. They gave Park a statement to say to the investigators, and Korean Air executives were reportedly present during the entire questioning. Since Park could tell the investigation was biased, he reported the story directly to the media, and that was when things got bad for Korean Air. They immediately issued a statement addressing the situation, apologizing for the inconvenience, but saying that it was Heather Cho's responsibility to enforce the procedures of the cabin crew and she was simply doing her job. Not sure what kind of job requires you to attack your employees, but maybe she was just making sure their combat skills were up to par. Their justification for Park being fired, despite him being totally in the right, was that he hadn't produced the proof quickly enough. And we know a woman who delayed a flight by 45 minutes over a bag of nuts really values timeliness. Further research into Cho revealed that this was not her first time behaving like this. In 2013, she physically assaulted a flight attendant who served her improperly cooked ramen noodles. This woman really is a hero for everyone who despises airline food. Cho was also involved in a separate controversy that same year when she traveled to Hawaii to give birth to her twin boys, therefore allowing them to be US citizens and avoid the South Korean mandatory military service. And in the interest of efficiency, maybe she was even able to clobber some flight attendants on the journey there. In fact, it seems most of the Cho family has a history of mean behavior, with Heather's sister, brother, and mother all involved in similar scandals. So the public wasn't buying the half-assed apology, and sales of Korean Air flights had dropped by 6.6%. Finally, the airline was forced to admit defeat. Cho Yang-ho stood before journalists and publicly apologized for his daughter's nut rage, calling it a foolish act and saying, "It's my fault. As chairman and father, I ask for the public's generous forgiveness." He also said that his daughter would be resigning from her positions at Korean Air. Heather Cho herself then stepped up to apologize in front of the media, hanging her head in shame and announcing that she would also be personally apologizing to Park and Kim. She reportedly went to their houses to do so, but neither of them were home, probably busy looking for jobs. So she left them both notes saying sorry instead. Glad she handled this apology like she was delivering a package that required a signature. Still, the backlash had reached a new level, with some people describing it as a national embarrassment and proof of Chaebol power abuse. The whole thing was then taken to court, where Heather Cho was found guilty of obstructing aviation safety and sentenced to 10 months in prison. She was released after 5. And I honestly have no idea if that's too much of a punishment or not enough. Korean Air was also fined $2.57 million by the Transport Ministry for the incident, as well as being ordered to pay $45,000 to Park for what he experienced. The whole thing even led to a revision in the South Korean aviation laws, increasing the punishments for disruptive passengers. But the best thing to come from this was in South Korean supermarkets, where sales of macadamia nuts rose 250% following the incident. And that wasn't even some kind of protest. The whole thing just gave people a craving, I guess. It also gave Heather Cho a bad public image, which seems to have followed her over the years. In 2023, she changed her name from Cho Hyun-ah to Cho Seong-yeon. Yeah, that should fix everything. As for the only other passenger in first class, she actually contacted Korean Air about the incident after it happened. In response, the airline sent her a calendar and a model airplane as an apology. And honestly, I don't think they owe her anything. She already got to witness the greatest in-flight entertainment of all time. Now please consider subscribing, or I'll turn this whole plane around and banish you to JFK Airport.